We've all heard of LDL, but there's something else that also causes heart disease and might actually be worse, nastier than LDL. 4 times worse if we compare them 1 to 1, same units. I spoke about this with Dr. Elias Björnsson, who researches heart disease at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Here's our conversation, and stay tuned for the recap in the end.
In the world of risk factors for cardiovascular disease, there are a couple of different risk factors, but the main category of risk factors, a main category are lipoproteins. And simply speaking, you can categorize atherogenic lipoproteins, that is, lipoproteins that can cause atherosclerosis, heart disease, into 3 different types. These 3 different types all contain a protein called ApoB. So they all contain ApoB, but they are slightly different from each other. So the first one that people may have heard of is the LDL particle that contains ApoB. The second one has many names, but one name is remnant. It's a remnant. It's also called a VLDL. It's kind of like an LDL particle, but it contains more triglycerides, and it actually contains a little bit more cholesterol as well per particle. But it's sort of like a bigger version of an LDL, and the VLDL can actually become an LDL. And then you have the third type of particle, which is called lipoprotein little a. But we'll keep that by the side for this moment. So when focusing on remnants versus LDL, there has throughout the years been some speculation, but there has never been very solid evidence on how atherogenic these lipoproteins are. One hypothesis is basically that they are equally atherogenic per particle. So it doesn't matter if you have one remnant or one LDL, they both crash in the artery wall, cause atherosclerosis. A competing hypothesis has been that these remnants are more atherogenic per particle. Why would they be that? Well, one idea is that since they do contain more cholesterol per particle, that could be a reason. It does contain other kind of lipids in and on the surface of the lipoprotein as well, so that could be more atherogenic in some other ways than an LDL. But there has never been a clear consensus and very, very solid evidence, because there has never been very good randomized control trials where you can draw these kinds of causal inference on the relative atherogenic. So that's the backstory, that's the background to try and figure out how dangerous is this particle compared to LDL. Maybe I should stop there. That's sort of the backstory to the whole to the whole question, and then we can move into the methodology, which is a much bigger question.
Yeah. Just to clarify, just in case some people, most of my viewers, I think, have heard the basic terminology, lipoproteins and these things, but just in case there are some people who are watching this who haven't heard these things, can you briefly describe what a lipoprotein is?
Yeah. So in our bloodstream, we need to transport both water-soluble stuff, but also fat-soluble stuff. So in order for us to do that, since the blood is actually mostly contains water, it will not like fat will not like to be in water. So, however, if you package fatty stuff within an envelope of something called phospholipids, you can sort of make it into a ball and protect it from the aqueous solution, and you can transport it that way. So you can think of often an idea is like tennis balls. They kind of look like tennis balls. So a tennis ball has a surface protecting the core from the outer environment, and these particles travels throughout the bloodstream. They can be produced mostly by the liver, but also from the intestine, and they are removed by various tissues in the body, but they are primarily removed by the liver as well. What's their purpose? Well, there are actually no clear consensus of exactly the purpose. There may be many different purposes of lipoproteins. One purpose may be to transport fat-soluble vitamins. Other purposes may be to transport cholesterol itself, although that may or may not be the primary purpose of lipoproteins. One purpose could be for the liver to actually get rid of excess lipids. Otherwise, you may develop fatty liver and so on. You may end up with troubles doing that. Well, if you can't produce lipoproteins, the liver may be sick by that. So they are produced, they get into the blood, they get cleared somehow. However, they can also crash into the artery wall and produce what we call plaques, which can then lead to cardiovascular disease.
Got it. Yeah. So they're like these vehicles to transport fats, lipids, and fats, and the types of vitamins, for example, that are fat soluble. All these things that would clump up in the blood because the blood is aqueous. These serve as vehicles like a submarine or a car or whatever vehicle you have in mind, an Uber that transports these fats back and forth in the bloodstream. And so these are the lipoproteins. And then you talked about the different classes. People might be wondering about HDLs, which are also types of lipoproteins. We left those out because we're focusing on the ones that are atherogenic, so the ones that cause this atherosclerosis, this type of heart disease and coronary disease. But HDLs would be the other kind of big family. And then within these, the atherogenic ones that are the ApoB carrying lipoproteins, as you explained, we then have these categories. We have LPA, which we've talked about in other videos. We have the LDLs. And then we have this big family of sometimes called triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, but yeah, there's this nomenclature of the remnants and all this stuff. Do you guys normally just call them? What do you guys call them in the lab, or what's like the quick name?
I usually call them remnants.
Remnants?
That's my remnants is the favorite go-to because it's sort of easy to say. Technically, it's more technically precise to call them triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, so TRLs, we say sometimes. So you can think of LDLs and TRLs. If you want an abbreviation, that's the go-to abbreviation for me. If you want just say it out loud, it's easier to say remnants instead of TRLs. So I usually say that.
Yeah.
For some reason, VLDLs hasn't caught on. So not many people refer to them as VLDLs, but that's
right.
That if you like an abbreviation, that's a good abbreviation as well.
Right. When I think of TRLs or TGRLs or however you want to say triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, this whole family, in my mind, it includes the VLDLs, it includes the IDLs as well. And but let me know if that's not correct. The chylomicrons, I think you mentioned that briefly, that come from the intestine. Those are, and then the remnants, we're basically talking about when those guys start delivering their cargo, their triglycerides to different tissues, and they become smaller and smaller. They're still technically VLDLs or chylomicrons, but sometimes we start calling them VLDL remnants or chylomicron remnants to distinguish from the original big, the OG particle with all the cargo. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So you mentioned IDLs as well, which is good. You can think of it just instead of categorizing, you can think of it as just a continuous distribution of particle size. So the liver and the intestine, they tend to output just when it's a newly produced particle, then it's not a remnant, then it's just the pure newborn particle. That's a very fatty, lots of triglycerides in that particle. Then lipases begin to metabolize those triglycerides, and then it starts to shrink. So then technically the first triglyceride that is lipolyzed from the particle, then it becomes a remnant, because it's not the OG, the original particle. It's a shrunken version of the OG particle. So then it shrinks down. If you classify it density, it will be a VLDL technically for quite some time, and then for a kind of a brief period of time, it will become an intermediate density lipoprotein, IDL, as you mentioned, before it becomes, you could say, the ultimate remnant, the LDL particle. That's just a continuous lipolysis step, and then shrinks down, and then it ultimately becomes an LDL.
Right. And people might be wondering, because it's a good point that this is somewhat arbitrary, because it's a continuum in practice. These divisions are somewhat artificial, but there is a difference in terms of composition, as you said, in terms of how much triglyceride and how much cholesterol is in there. There's also a difference in terms of the proteins on the surface, right? So there are some differences physiologically between these things. It's not just a complete continuum of the same thing, bigger and smaller.
No, you're right. So there are distinct, even though something continuously changes, at some point it changes enough for it to become a distinctly different type of particle. And one way to also kind of differentiate that I use in my mind is that what is the clearance pathway? If it can be cleared, if it can be lipolyzed, for example, if it contains enough triglycerides for it to be a good substrate for LPL, lipoprotein lipase, then it's a triglyceride-rich lipoprotein, right? Because lipoprotein lipase likes that as a substrate. When enough triglyceride has been removed, LPL doesn't like it anymore. Then it needs to be, then it's on the other hand, a good substrate for the LDL receptor. Then it becomes, now the LDL receptor it shrinks enough for it to be recognized, and then it can be removed that way. So it's the catabolism, the catabolic pathways differ depending on the size and the lipid composition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the question you guys were attacking was this question of this family of TRLs or remnants, however people want to call them all. Are they just as nasty as LDL? Are they less nasty? Are they more? Are they nastier? And it was kind of controversial. Some people thought they were equally atherogenic, and some people thought there might be differences there. And so, how did you guys go about testing this?
Yeah, so just as a background hypothesis, I don't believe anyone thought that the remnant or the triglyceride-rich lipoprotein was not atherogenic. I do believe that everyone thought that it was atherogenic at some degree. So therefore, hence, maybe equally as an LDL or maybe even higher. So those were the two plausible options before our research. So what did we do to answer this question? Well, we used a methodological approach called Mendelian randomization. Now, that's a big word, and it's not easy to grasp just the first time you hear it. But you can make actually a comparison to a randomized controlled trial. So in a randomized controlled trial, you randomize people to a drug or no drug, or maybe one drug versus another drug, something like that. And everything else between the subjects is just randomly, there are no systematic differences between the groups. If you do that, you can actually say, if something changed in that group that I gave that drug, it's likely that that was actually caused by the drug. Now, there's an analogy in Mendelian randomization, and that is that some people inherit genetic variants. Back in the days, you call them mutations. You don't call them that anymore. We call them SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or genetic variants. So maybe some people just by pure chance happen to have a genetic variant that makes them have lower LDL cholesterol, for example, or higher LDL cholesterol, or lower remnant cholesterol, or higher remnant cholesterol. So you see where I'm getting at. So we specifically looked for genetic variants that affected either LDLs up or down, or remnants up or down. And we used the UK Biobank data for this, which is roughly 500,000 British citizens that were genotyped and followed for 12, 13, 14, 15 years at this point. So what you can do is that you can look for genetic variants that either affect, as I said, LDLs or remnants. And then you can classify. So basically, we found over 1,000 of these genetic variants that had some effect on either LDL and or remnants. So what we then tried to do was to categorize the genetic variants into those that predominantly or almost exclusively affected LDL. We tried to look for, if you keep everything constant, but you move LDL, or vice versa, the other type of SNP category, genetic variant that changed remnant levels without affecting LDL. So in practice, this is quite difficult because many SNPs change them both a little bit in between. So they have had this sort of both remnant and LDL effect. But there is enough variation, it turns out, in nature. So there does exist genetic variants that predominantly affects remnants and those that predominantly affect LDLs. And then you can utilize this information actually to work out mathematically how risky is it if I move LDL up or down, or how risky is it if I move remnants up or down. So specifically, what we do is I may or may have not mentioned it in our little lipoprotein school here, but both LDLs and remnants contain exactly one copy of this protein called ApoB. So LDL have one ApoB, remnants have one exactly ApoB. So now, if we now have these genetic variants, we can actually relate. If you change LDL ApoB, so LDL particle number, by a fixed amount, what change in cardiovascular risk do you get? We can answer that question. And then, of course, we can answer the question, if you use the other types of SNPs that predominantly affect remnants, for the same given increase now in remnant ApoB, how does that relate to cardiovascular risk, change in cardiovascular risk? And is that delta in risk the same for LDL or for remnants? And the take-home message is that it does not appear to be same. So for the same unit increase in ApoB, you get a certain risk increased by LDLs, but you get maybe roughly a 3 or 4-fold higher risk increase if you change remnant particle number the same amount. So hence our sort of take-home message that remnants are probably around 4-fold as atherogenic per individual particles as LDL appear to be.
My understanding is you guys looked at LDL cholesterol and triglyceride-rich lipoprotein cholesterol, and then instead of looking directly at the particle number, that's I think because the UK Biobank does not have the metric of measuring lipoproteins. Is that correct or not? And if so, how do you get from the lipids to the lipoproteins?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And this question is very difficult to explain if you're not very versed into the nitty-gritty of this Mendelian randomization methodology. But first, what we can do, and what we did do, is that to relate the risk change in terms of cholesterol units, as you say. So we can quantify LDL cholesterol in UK Biobank, and we can quantify remnant cholesterol in UK Biobank. So what you can start by doing then, forget about the particle number. Now we're just thinking about cholesterol content. So you can do exactly the same. One unit, for example, 1 millimole per liter of LDL cholesterol. How does that causally affect risk of cardiovascular events? For the same 1 millimole per liter unit increase in remnant cholesterol, how does that relate to risk? And the answer is that in that type of analysis, if you do it per cholesterol, we get a roughly 3-fold something, 2.5 to 3.5-fold higher risk per 1 unit remnant cholesterol than 1 unit LDL cholesterol. So, but this is not per particle now. But as you say, those measures are actually measured in UK Biobank. We can quantify them and relate them to risk. And if we do find that remnant cholesterol per unit cholesterol is higher, then it must mean that also per number of particles, it will be higher. Simply because remnants are actually, as I mentioned before, not cholesterol. They actually contain more cholesterol per particle. So if you think about that for a second, so if we have one particle that contains more cholesterol per particle and another particle contains less cholesterol per particle, and you relate cholesterol to risk, and you get a higher per cholesterol unit for remnants, then you can definitely infer that. Then you can say, okay, then the factor that we get, which is maybe a 3-fold, it must be at least 3-fold higher per particle, since it contains more cholesterol per particle. So I will let that sink in for a second, because then we come to the second step of doing it per number of particles, and that's another type of analysis that we employed then. So do you want me to go into that, or should we linger on the per cholesterol results first?
I think the main question for me, and I imagine for viewers who are following along and have seen some of my content previously and are kind of familiar with the basics here, is that when we see a change in cholesterol level, yes, it could reflect a change in particle number, but it could also just reflect particles that are richer or poorer in cholesterol content. So that if we see an increase in cholesterol, it could just be that the particle has become richer in cholesterol, or a mix of both. So yeah, I think the general question is how do we get from the lipids to the particle number? I understand that there's a level of uncertainty always if we don't have a measure of the particle number. But how do you reconcile that, and how do you think of that issue in terms of this leap?
Yeah, so Mendelian randomization analysis can only estimate the average particle. It cannot say anything about if a particle is more or less cholesterol rich. So this is an important point. Our results is only relating an average type of remnant particle to an average type of LDL particle. We say nothing about what happens if the cholesterol to ApoB ratio changes within the particle. But that's just by the very nature of the Mendelian randomization methodology. We deal with population averages. We can say, how's an average particle relate to risk? We don't say anything about. Then it can absolutely, as you say, be that there may be more or less risky types of remnants. There may be more or less risky types of LDLs. But an average remnant, at least according to our results, is more atherogenic than an LDL, than an average LDL. Yeah. So the regarding your other first question, how can we relate particle number, something that is actually not measured in UK Biobank, to risk? Well, first of all, there is actually measured particle numbers, and we have done that analysis as well using NMR data. So there is available NMR data in UK Biobank, so you can get a measured VLDL particle number, and you can relate VLDL P to LDL P, and you can redo the same Mendelian randomization analysis as I just said before, but for cholesterol. So we of course did that as well, but we didn't publish that. But we got the expected results, namely that per NMR estimated particle remnants are several-fold more atherogenic.
Oh, interesting.
But then there's a third version, a methodology. You can triangulate even further, and that is when you find a genetic variant that changes LDL cholesterol. So let's say we find a genetic variant that only affects LDL cholesterol and nothing else. Then we can say, aha, so it doesn't change remnants, it doesn't change Lp(a), it only changes LDLs. Then we can actually quantify how much is ApoB, plasma ApoB, changed by that very genetic variant. So that delta in plasma ApoB must be LDL ApoB, because nothing else has changed.
Probably. I'm following the logic. Yeah, I think it's likely that the change is mainly coming from LDL, unless it's a more complicated scenario where you had a in the remnants, the number of remnants changed in the same proportion or something like that to the LDLs. It'd just be a more complicated scenario, but I understand what you're saying. It's the most likely cases that only LDLs have changed. Yeah.
I mean, as you say, there is you can make a very complicated story up as for why that delta ApoB does not reflect LDL ApoB. But then it must involve that genetic variant also affects the composition of maybe LDLs and or remnants. So in fact, it doesn't show any effect on remnant cholesterol, but maybe it actually changes remnant cholesterol to ApoB ratio or something like that.
Right.
But then that has to be systematically true for several hundreds of SNPs,
Right.
which is extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
So the most, Occam's razor type of explanation is that those several hundreds of SNPs that predominantly affect LDL cholesterol, if you look at the ApoB change there, that will in average reflect an LDL ApoB change. And then you do the same with SNPs that predominantly affect remnants. That change in ApoB it probably reflects remnant ApoB change. And then you relate that delta ApoB to cardiovascular risk, compare that to the LDL ApoB to cardiovascular risk. And then in the context of the NMR-based analysis and the cholesterol-based analysis, and we did several other types of sensitivity analysis using polygenic scores as well. All of those analyses paint exactly the same picture. And if you do that latter ApoB-based analysis, you get roughly a fourfold difference in atherogenic potential per particle per ApoB.
So just to summarize this and make sure that I understand, in the main analysis that was published, you did have the ApoB measurement, right? Not just, you had the lipids and the ApoB, just not the complete NMR panel. And so you're looking at these changes of the lipids, and you know how much ApoB is changing, and you're taking the average. Basically, if one SNP, for example, changes LDL cholesterol, let's say, to make it simple, let's say in one SNP, all of the changes in the LDL cholesterol and none in VLDL in the remnant cholesterol, and then you have a certain change in ApoB, you're assuming for the purposes of the analysis that all the change in ApoB is coming from the change in LDL particles, and that amount is going to be then using the LDL cholesterol change, and vice versa. And then in proportion, if you have change of both lipids, you're assuming that the same proportion is going to apply to the ApoB change. But you also then have this other analysis that you mentioned that was not published, that seems like a good confirmation step, where you look at actual NMR data, at actual measurements of particles, and there you get rid of this margin of error of the assumption of the lipids to the particle number, and there it sounds like you got a roughly the same result.
Yeah, that's true. So I think the reason why we didn't publish the NMR data results was that not to overload the paper, and we did that analysis to really do all the diligence we can to be very confident in the results before we publish, because we know that these results may appear to be surprising or controversial for some people, maybe not for others. So we triangulated using different assumptions, different techniques. We used the polygenic risk score methodology as well, which is separate from the main analysis. So we did all the type of sensitivity analysis that we could do over a period of maybe 18 or 24 months, something like that. We tried really, really hard to kill the results, and but no matter how we did the analysis, the results came out pretty much the same. If we used NMR, it came out the same. If we used per cholesterol, it came out as expected. If you used per ApoB, it came out as expected. If you used polygenic risk score approach, it came out as expected. Actually, which we also didn't publish, was that if we used purely observational data, not Mendelian randomization data, we get exactly the same results as well. So then we sort of drew a line that we said that when you get these kind of consistent results, we have to publish, and we just have to make sure that we do all the, as I said, all the due diligence that we can, given the data that is available.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, and it's an interesting also exchange with Alan Snyderman and the piece that he wrote, kind of giving a counterpoint of I think he's a little bit skeptical of this effect of the remnants being substantially more atherogenic than LDLs, and I think he presents some interesting counterpoints, some interesting counter arguments, and then I think he also puts forward this idea that maybe this is true, but it's for a percentage of people that is relatively small or for very specific populations. And so maybe that explains all the observations, why you guys see this reproducibly, and then it doesn't match other findings that we have. He's trying to reconcile everything, which I think is what we have to do. So I don't know if
Absolutely. You want... I agree. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we need to not use only our evidence. We need to use all the types of evidence that is available in the literature so far to try and triangulate and come up with a plausible scenario. What I will point out is that I personally do not believe that our results will change clinical practice, substantially, or simply because of the reason that remnants are much less abundant than LDLs. So yes, they may be more atherogenic per particle, but they are literally 10 times as common in the bloodstream for an average person. So for every 100 particles, only around 10 of them are remnants. So it will not, in terms of risk and clinical practice, that's a different story. And you shouldn't take our results and now say that, all the risk is on remnants. No, that's not the case. Still a majority of all risk is on the LDL particle, because it's vastly much more abundant.
I think this is the key point for people to understand, that one thing is risk per particle. So for the same number of particles, your data indicates whether it's a specific context of a specific population or not is up for grabs. But you guys are showing that in this context, at least the same number of particles of remnants or triglyceride-rich lipoproteins is riskier than the same number of LDLs. But in the vast majority of people, they have a lot more LDLs present in the blood. So it would still be the total amount of risk that's coming from the LDL population is still much higher than the total amount of risk coming from the remnant population. But then it gets interesting depending on the exact individual, right? If this balance changes in specific populations, I don't know what are your thoughts, like people with diabetes or people on statins? Where do you think this becomes more relevant?
Yeah, so most people on that have diabetes, they may also have hypertriglyceridemia. So particularly if there is a population, I wouldn't say yes, diabetes, but more as a proxy for the hypertriglyceridemia. So I would say that people who have maybe are in the top 10th percentile or so, the top 90th percentile or higher in the population, maybe they have triglyceride levels. So if they have a plasma triglyceride level of maybe 3 millimole per liter, something like that, or above, then it starts to become the inference from our results is that for those levels, you start to you can't ignore the remnant risk. Then it becomes a major player in all your risk. So as an example, let's say for a top for a 90th percentile or plus individual who has hypertriglyceridemia, maybe 20% of all particles are remnants compared to LDL. Let's forget about Lp(a) for a second. So let's just look at some numbers. So let's say you have 100 particles. 20 of those are triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, and 80 are LDLs. So let's take our headline results. So triglyceride-rich lipoproteins are 4 times as atherogenic. Then we can multiply that 20 particles by 4. Then we have 80 sort of risk equivalent units. And how many LDLs did we have? Well, yes, we had also 80. So then we're talking risk equivalence, basically 50-50 of your risk may be carried by remnants versus LDLs. But again, that's a relatively uncommon individual. Yes, it may be 1 in 10 or higher. So it's not a non-issue. It is important for that population. Whereas for the general population, it's less of an issue that you really have to clinically look at. So you also mentioned if you're let's say type 2 diabetic taking a statin. Yes, it is true that let's say you're a hypertriglyceridemic individual taking a statin. You have reduced your LDL particle number quite a bit, but maybe you still have elevated remnants. Not that uncommon in practice. Then it may be the case that maybe 60-70% of your atherogenic risk is carried by remnants. Mind you that is simply also a result for the lowering of the LDL. So you're taking down the LDL risk. What risk is remaining then is disproportionately or kind of looks relatively high in terms of for the remnants. However, if you are really interested in reducing your total risk, this sort of residual risk could be the remnants could be a major source of this residual risk in this context. So you should certainly not neglect that, and every means necessary to reduce remnant triglyceride proteins will certainly be helpful in that context. One little caveat, though, is that many people do not realize that statins also lowers remnant cholesterol. So the benefit you get from statins is not only isolated to LDLs. So let's say, for example, you take a statin that lowers your LDL cholesterol by 50%. That actually also typically lowers your remnant cholesterol by maybe 25%, something like that. And so statins themselves also do contribute a little bit to reducing your residual remnant-related risk. So it's just something that many people forget. But when it's a little bit like PCSK9 inhibitors that has this benefit of reducing Lp(a) as well, maybe 20-30%, something like that. Statins has this sort of extra boost by reducing remnants a little bit, and you should neglect that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are important points, and just to reiterate, so statins will reduce all of these ApoB lipoproteins, but they are better at reducing the LDL fraction than the VLDL fraction or the remnant fraction. So what we're talking about when saying residual risk is people on a statin have brought their LDLs down, so they're not at significant risk from that anymore. But sometimes these remnants are still higher because the statins aren't as good as bringing them down, and so there's this remaining cardiovascular risk that hasn't been addressed, and a portion of that is coming from these particles. And so that's a context where this factor of the increased atherogenicity of the remnants comes into play, because you have these particles that remained, and it seems like they're a minority, but they are also nastier particle for particle, so they become more of a big deal.
Yes, and I should mention an analogy in that sense is that, let's say you have high LDL and you take a statin or a PCSK9 inhibitor, you will reduce LDL a lot and statins a little bit, or remnants a little bit in addition, maybe a little bit extra LDL, but those risk bars, now you shrunk LDL a lot, but what is still remaining if you have high LDL is the LDL related risk. So your residual risk, if you have high LDL, will be in large part due to LDL then. So, and just to put these numbers a little bit further into context, that maybe a typical person has somewhere around 200 nanomole per liter, or 150 to 200 nanomole per liter of remnant particles. And according to our research, we have applied the same methodologies to LDL as well. And what we can say is that the genetic evidence seems to support the role that remnants and LDL are roughly equally atherogenic. So now you're in a situation where you have 200 maybe nanomole per liter of remnants, and then maybe you have 200 nanomole per liter of LDL as well. If you're that kind of person, those two will be two big risk contributors, especially if you have lowered LDL quite a lot. Maybe you're on a PCSK9 inhibitor or something like that. So it's all just a numbers game. How many LDLs do you have times how atherogenic they are? How many remnants do you have times how atherogenic they are? How many LDLs do you have times how atherogenic they are? And depending on what person you have, those numbers may come out differently. But having said that, LDL for most people is the absolute dominant risk factor.
Yeah, I guess when these things become more crystallized and more demonstrated and accepted across the board, when we have specific numbers that everybody agrees with, I mean, people will come up with calculators where you just enter all these numbers and it gives you your risk, which is a pretty simple formula, but it's still kind of controversial. What's the exact contribution of the remnants and all this stuff? And so on that point, had a couple of questions here. One is just to get an idea of the prevalence of this. Do you know, in a Western population, let's say typical like a US population or something like that, because it's typically a pretty sick population, what's the prevalence of people who would have this concentration of remnants that's high enough that's causing a substantial risk coming from the remnants?
Well, I guess that depends on where you draw the line of substantial risk. But I would say that okay, I'll just take you the typical Western person first. So the typical person, just a median person, maybe has, as I said, maybe 150 to 200 nanomole per liter of remnants. So let's say 150. So 150, and that typical person maybe has 10 times as many LDLs, so 1500. So 1500, 150. All right. And the median person has very low LDL, so you can almost ignore LDL in that context. So if our genetically predicted results are correct, then the implication for a median person is that maybe 25%, 30% of your total ApoB risk is carried by remnants, and the rest 70 to 75% is carried by LDL. Now, where would you say that remnants are a substantial risk contributor, maybe you would draw the line at 50-50. So if remnants contribute half of your entire risk, I would say that's a substantial risk contributor. And where do you get that? Well, you get that typically if you have I would say a plasma triglyceride level of 3 millimole per liter or above. Then my guess, this applies to UK Biobank, so maybe 1 in 10 people have that kind of level. So the average Joe, maybe a quarter of the risk would be on remnants, quarter to a third. The 1 in 10 individual maybe has half of their risk on remnants.
I remember from the study, and I think we talked about this on Twitter, that there seemed to be sort of a cutoff, but I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, that it was about 20 to 30% of the total remnants had to be, no, 20 to 30% of ApoB had to be remnants for the risk of remnants to be measurable or significant. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're remembering correctly. So what we did in our this is a little bit difficult to explain, but what we did in our Mendelian randomization analysis is to quantify the risk depending on how many percent of, now here comes another difficult term, non-HDL cholesterol is constituted by remnant cholesterol. So I will just, what the heck is non-HDL cholesterol? Non-HDL cholesterol is simply put LDL cholesterol plus remnant cholesterol. So a typical person maybe has 15% of the non-HDL cholesterol being remnant cholesterol, and the rest, 85%, being LDL cholesterol. But if you, in our Mendelian randomization analysis, we chose genetic variants that change this cholesterol ratio within non-HDL. So for a given increase in non-HDL, if it was 10% of the non-HDL was remnant cholesterol, 15, 20, 25, etc. And we actually found genetic variants that per 1 unit increase in non-HDL cholesterol, 2/3 of it was remnant cholesterol. So that is a strong genetic variant that not only affect remnants, but almost only affect remnants. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we found genetic variants that of the non-HDL cholesterol change, 95% was LDL cholesterol, so only 5% was remnant cholesterol. That gave us this dynamic range, enough variation that we needed for our analysis to quantify the relative atherogenicidity. And if you plot the risk per the same given increase in particle number, depending on what percentage you have on by remnant cholesterol as a percentage of non-HDL cholesterol, you can sort of see a breaking point at 25 something percent. It's a little bit fussy, but then Alan Schneiderman in his editorial rightly pointed out that not many individuals are above this breaking point. So the point being that therefore non-HDL cholesterol is a good enough measure. Not many people have like 50% of their non-HDL cholesterol as remnant cholesterol. That almost never happens. And he's right in that. He's right in pointing out that. But the reason why we did this graph is to basically fundamentally try to quantify the particle atherogenicidity. And then it's a totally separate question, as I mentioned before, to try and infer the clinical utility of that. And Alan Snyderman is right, and I've just said it here, that most people are pretty similar in their non-HDL cholesterol, LDL to remnant cholesterol ratio. So yes, it is true. Even though remnants are more atherogenic, if everybody has the same, then you can just, if everyone by definition had the same ratio, you can just measure LDL cholesterol. That would be a great risk marker. So that, however, I would say that this does not mean that if you are below this breaking point where we saw clearly that the particle atherogenicidity really rose, then remnants will not contribute to your risk at all. That's not actually the inference you can draw from that graph. So remnants will contribute to risk at any level above 0. And then it's just a matter of defining what's high enough, what is a substantial risk contribution.
So, okay, so it's not 0, it's not all or nothing. So what's the 20 to that 20 to 30% cutoff? What does that determine? Is it like a jump in the atherogenicity?
Well, it's just if you the statistical precision or power that we had to detect the difference is, let's say, if we find a genetic variant that by 30% or more affects remnant cholesterol, then we can say with statistical confidence that that infers a higher risk. Okay, we're sure about that. And luckily, we did find genetic variants, many hundreds of them, that were like 35, 40, 50, 55, even 68% risk. So we had plenty of statistical power to determine the atherogenicity if there was the difference. If there wasn't a difference, you should have just expected a flat line. So regardless of your composition of non-HDL, you should get the same risk. There shouldn't be a gradient. There just should be a flat line like that.
Yeah. So under 25 to 30%, you couldn't pick up a statistically significant increase. So it might still be there or not. We don't know. TBD, right?
Yeah. So if it turned out that there were no genetic variants that changed the ratio as substantially as they turned out to do. So let's say we only had genetic variants that changed the ratio from 20 to, or let's say from 18 to 22%, something like that. That would not be enough variance for us to make an inference about the particle atherogenicidity. Then we could just say, we give up. We can't infer this. But luckily, there was this range, and that allowed us to make the quantification with good statistical power. But to reiterate, you shouldn't draw the conclusion that therefore that has huge clinical implications. That's not the inference. The inference is that this has clinical implications only if people differ in their composition of non-HDL. So let's say remnants were 100 times more atherogenic, but everyone just had very, very low levels of remnants and no one had high. Then it would just simply be an academic interesting question, but it wouldn't be a practically relevant question.
The remnant cholesterol, there is a simple way to calculate, but I don't know how accurate that is. But if you just take total cholesterol minus LDL cholesterol minus HDL cholesterol, that gives you the remnant cholesterol. Is that right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, but there's a big caveat. So if you have calculated LDL cholesterol, for example, by the Residual formula, then mathematically, if you do that calculation, as you just said, mathematically, you will calculate triglycerides. So the result you get when you do that
Right.
will be a 1-to-1 correlation with plasma triglycerides.
Mm-hmm.
But if you use any method that directly measures LDL cholesterol, you can do that calculation, and that is indeed what we found in UK Biobank. So in UK Biobank, they had a direct measure of LDL cholesterol, so we can actually quantify by calculation the remnant cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a big, this is a big question now. If remnants are remnants worthwhile quantifying separately? If so, what method should you use?
Right.
So should you use an assay for it? There are, I would say, there are assays, but there is no very cheap, easy to use assay that is widely accepted yet. So I would say that method that if you have quantified LDL cholesterol directly and not calculated, you can absolutely use that calculation to calculate remnant cholesterol. That will work. Otherwise, you're stuck with plasma triglycerides.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody that does have the direct LDL, and do you think this is worth calculating? How should people think about this in general out there? Should they look at this number? What number what range should they be shooting for? What can they do about it, like in actionable terms?
Well, it depends on how pragmatic you want to be. If you only have a standard lipid panel, let's say we live in that world, I would be happy to quantify risk. I would look at non-HDL cholesterol. But I will, however, make a caveat that if you have very high triglyceride levels, let's say any level, I want my triglycerides below 1. So below 1, or the lower the better, but below 1, that's good. Many people are not below 1. Many people are between 1 and 2, maybe 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, 2, something like that. Then it's just a matter of degree. If you're getting up to 2.5, 3, then I would say that the non-HDL cholesterol as a risk measure will start to break down a little bit. So yes, look at non-HDL cholesterol from the standard lipid panel. Keep a little extra eye on the triglyceride number as well. If it's super high, then non-HDL cholesterol will not tell you the whole risk story.
Mm-hmm. In other words, if your triglyceride is not mega high, the non-HDL cholesterol, which is a kind of the poor man's ApoB, right? It's kind of a reflection of ApoB. So the non-HDL cholesterol is going to give you a pretty good readout of risk. If your triglycerides are extremely high, then that indicates, and 3 millimole per liter is what, like probably like 250 milligrams per deciliter, something like that.
Yeah, so it's 250, something like that, 250, 275, yeah.
Yeah. So if somebody has like super high triglycerides, that indicates that the number of those remnants is abnormally high as well. And so the total risk might be even higher than the non-HDL cholesterol would suggest, because the composition of the non-HDL cholesterol is abnormally enriched in remnants. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And you also mentioned that non-HDL cholesterol would be the poor man's ApoB measure, and this is a whole separate discussion. But you would believe from our research that I would favor non-HDL cholesterol actually between, if the choice is ApoB or non-HDL cholesterol, you can't measure anything else. You only have ApoB or only non-HDL cholesterol. Like, as I mentioned in the start of this presentation or talk, remnants are actually more cholesterol enriched per particle. So they have more cholesterol per particle, meaning per ApoB, than LDLs do. That will favor non-HDL cholesterol as a better risk measure than ApoB, because it will more closely approximate the risk shared by remnants. So let's say, a simple example, let's say remnants were 4 times as cholesterol enriched compared to an LDL, and they are 4 times more atherogenic. Then the cholesterol measure will capture all the risk, because it's 4 times more cholesterol, 4 times more risk. Then per cholesterol, it will be the same risk, right? So then non-HDL is a great measure. We don't quite live in that world. So remnants are not 4 times more cholesterol enriched. But measuring only the ApoB content to measure the cholesterol content, then the cholesterol content will reflect risk better than ApoB. However, so if that was the only fact on the table, you would choose non-HDL cholesterol over ApoB, which is surprising. But that's not the only fact on the table, actually. So it turns out that the cholesterol to ApoB ratio of LDL particles, when that is off, the risk tends to track with the number of LDLs rather than the cholesterol content of the LDLs. So if that is true, which it does seem to be, definitely from the literature and from my own investigations in UK Biobank, that will favor ApoB as a risk measure. So you have these opposing forces. One force saying, remnants are more atherogenic, then cholesterol content, then that should favor non-HDL. On the other hand, you have the discordance type of effect, which will favor ApoB as a risk measure. Where do we come out in the end? My best guess so far is that I would actually favor, in a perfect world, I would favor ApoB as the risk measure, because I believe this discordant type of effect is actually stronger to rule over the effect of the non-HDL cholesterol composition thing. However, I do think it's almost a wash. Both of these measures are good risk measures for a majority of the population.
Yeah, it's probably.
But as if anyone is versed in the literature of Lp(a), they will know that if you only measure ApoB and you have a high Lp(a), Lp(a) is not many particles, so then you will miss risk from the ApoB measure if you only measure ApoB without measuring Lp(a).
Right.
So what's the best version? Well, of course, measure everything. So measure Lp(a), measure ApoB, measure non-HDL cholesterol, measure remnant cholesterol. Preferably find a method that measures remnant ApoB if it's NMR or some other method. But we also, unfortunately, have a limited brain capacity to take all of these measures into account simultaneously. Hence, a kind of a simple message to boil down is, if you have ApoB, that's a good measure. If you have non-HDL cholesterol, that's also a pretty good measure.
Yeah, they're both pretty close, and I suspect it will depend on the population, on the specifics of the population you might see. And I think we see that in some analyses, ApoB comes out on top, and then others, non-HDL cholesterol comes out a little bit on top. But yeah, I try to look at both and try to keep them both in a healthy range, and that way, I'm safe, I guess. Yeah, I had one last thing, because I think Alan makes really interesting points in his commentary, in his editorial. One thing that he points out is that the trials, looking at fibrates, for example, so for example, if we look at Prominent, which is one of the most recent ones, they use a fibrate that lowers triglycerides by a lot, by like 30%, and lowers VLDL cholesterol. But then ApoB, there wasn't much difference. I think it was with an increase of 5%, and risk MACE, no significant change. So he's arguing that argues against this increased atherogenicity of remnants, because presumably these fibrates are reducing remnants, but they're increasing LDL. So if remnants were that much nastier, we should see lower risk. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an excellent question, Gil. And basically, the short version is that what the hell happened in Prominent? And as you say, LDL, remnant cholesterol was reduced by not 30%, but 26%. Okay, so depending on how you measure, triglyceride levels were reduced by 26%. Remnant cholesterol was reduced by roughly 18%. Okay, so that's good. That looks good. On the other hand, we saw an increase in LDL cholesterol by 12%, and an accompanying increase in ApoB, plasma ApoB, by 5%. So what has happened in Prominent? If you do the math, for every remnant particle you reduce in Prominent, you roughly gain back 2 or even 3 LDL particles.
Oh, I see.
So,
okay, but that should,
for every remnant particle you reduce, you get 2 or 3 back, right? So if remnants are 4 times more atherogenic, then actually it should, even in the end, result in a slight risk reduction. But the power for Prominent was powered for a 16% risk reduction, which is then the predicted risk reduction you would get from if you only go on the Mendelian randomization results is maybe 6%, 5-6% risk reduction, something like that, and it was way underpowered for that. So unfortunately, you can't draw any conclusions from Prominent.
Yeah, it's consistent with multiple explanations.
That's a terrible conclusion from Prominent.
He says that there are some meds that are coming out that are either being developed or are starting to be trialed that mainly reduce remnant cholesterol and don't change ApoB much, or don't change LDL cholesterol much, and those will be maybe the tiebreaker.
Yeah, so I think so too. So I think I think the proof is in the randomized control trial. So you can do all the academic exercises you want with the genetic data, and that's good. You should do that if you have the available genetic data, and we have these Mendelian randomization methodologies. You should absolutely do that. However, in the end, what is practically relevant for people is, do we find something that reduces remnants and therefore reduces risk? And that all depends on, can you find any drugs that do that? And can you reduce it enough to lower risk? And is that clinically relevant? Is it costly, and so on? So that is a completely the practical relevant evidence that you in the end need. And there are companies doing that now. For example, Arrowhead is developing an silencing RNA drug that targets ApoC3.
Mm.
So if you look at the data coming out from those phase 2 trials, it looks like remnant cholesterol, plasma triglycerides is reduced quite a bit. So it has a nice big effect size and no effect on LDL. So it doesn't seem to have this unexpected or unfortunate LDL increasing effect that Prominent had.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the results from that Arrowhead trial, which I believe is hopefully coming to fruition, that trial is at least being planned. That would be fantastic for the field, just for academic reasons and for practical reasons. If you have a few key messages, don't forget that one key message is still that LDL is the major risk factor. I keep emphasizing this point because if you don't emphasize the point, people will take the research and do their own interpretation wrongly of it. So I think that's important.
People do tend to do that on social media. They will look at a study or they will find what they want to find by hook or by crook. They will bend everything.
Oh yeah.
Sounds good, man. I appreciate the context, the putting things in context.
Okay, quick recap of everything. Remnants are large lipoproteins. They're related to LDL, but they're much larger, and there's some other differences. And they also cause heart disease. Particle for particle, they seem to be about 4 times worse than LDL for heart disease risk. Now, most people have a lot more LDLs than remnants in circulation, so LDL is still going to be a larger component of risk, but in people who have very high triglycerides, indicating that they have a lot of remnants, or in people who have lowered their LDL, remnants can become a larger component of their risk. Elias gave this cutoff of 3 millimoles per liter triglycerides, or about 250, 260 milligrams per deciliter, where people have so many remnants that they become a major component of risk and can even trump LDL for overall risk if triglycerides are high enough, if the number of remnants is high enough. This can happen, for example, in people who are very overweight, who are obese, who have diabetes. In those groups, the number of remnants tends to be elevated. This is especially true, for example, people who have type 2 diabetes, they often get prescribed lipid-lowering medication because their risk of heart disease is higher. And so that tends to lower the LDL fraction. So now that's lower, but their remnants are higher. And so in those individuals, remnants can become a major component, even the major component of their cardiovascular risk. And so in those individuals, you might look at your blood work and go, oh, my LDL is really low. And your doctor might look at it and go, great, you have very low LDL. Cool. But let's not forget that there are multiple things that cause heart disease risk. Let's not become one-trick ponies. Some people who have low LDL can still have problems. For example, if the number of remnants is very high, if their LPA is very high, there's a number of factors. We call that residual risk, the risk that still remains after the LDL fraction of lipoproteins is handled. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, one thing is we can calculate our remnant cholesterol. That gives us an idea of how we're doing in terms of remnants. And you can do that with your basic lipid panel, no special tests needed. It's total cholesterol minus HDL cholesterol minus LDL cholesterol. Now, caveat, that only works if your LDL cholesterol is measured, not if it's calculated. And in your lipid panel, it should say under your LDL cholesterol level, it should say if it's calculated or measured. You can also get a sense of your remnants by your triglyceride levels. So if your triglycerides are not very high, if they're under 100 or they're about not mega high, then your ApoB and your non-HDL cholesterol are good estimates of risk. Non-HDL cholesterol is just total cholesterol minus HDL. And if you don't have an ApoB, it's a good alternative. And you want it under 130 milligrams per deciliter, under 100 better, but under 130, good start. So in a lot of people, those are good measures, ApoB, non-HDL cholesterol. But if your triglycerides are very high, 250, 300, something like that, then it is possible that your ApoB or your non-HDL may underestimate your risk because it looks at total particles, but you may have a lot of remnants, and the risk of those seems to be higher than LDLs, for example. So good to be aware if you have low LDL but very high triglycerides, might be a red flag, might be something to look into. I know that all these names, all these formulas, these calculations are a huge pain in the rear end. This is going to get better with time because measurement of the actual lipoproteins and the actual particles, because that's what causes risk, and measurement of that is going to become more mainstream and more default. So this is going to get easier with time. And I want to make a website at some point for you guys with all these calculators in one place, and you can just enter your basic lipid panel and it can spit out all of these results for you. So that's work in progress. In the meantime, for a lot more information on how to lower your triglycerides in a healthy way with lifestyle, check out this video, and I'll see you in there.